by the winter of 1917, going into 1918, things were pretty grim for a lot of the participants, and they all were pretty much aware that there was no winning that was going to come out of this. The Ottoman Empire was falling apart. It had lost most of its Arab territory to the Arab Revolt. Romania had engaged a disastrous campaign, in which they were actually beaten by Austria-Hungary, which was an embarrassment by this point. So even more of an embarrassment for Romania, and they call for an armistice at the end of 1917. Bulgaria, even though it had taken over a lot of Serbia, which had been what started the war, they were locked into stalemate on the Salonika front, and that was accomplishing nothing. The Austro-Hungarians and the Italians basically canceled each other out at a battle called Caporetto, which pretty much took them both out of contention and in affecting the outcome of the war. The Russian Republic was falling apart due to the increasing influence of the Bolsheviks, and so this map shows you kind of where the Bolshevik centers of influence were. The more radical communist revolutionaries, led by Lenin and the Petrograd Soviet. This was the case in fall of 1917. By spring of 1918, within a few months, the Russian Republic's gone, replaced by the Soviet Russia. Bolsheviks are in control, and they start closing down the war effort and eventually sign away a huge part of their territory, which we'll talk about in a minute. But at this point, all sides are trying to figure out how they can win the peace. And France and Britain's strategy is to try to bring the United States' resources online as quickly as possible in order to force Germany to terms. Germany's strategy was to try to defeat France and Britain, or not defeat them, but deal a grievous enough blow that it will bring France and Britain to the table before they can really start leveraging the American assistance. So that was where they were at, and Germany is increasingly getting desperate. The blockade is having an increasingly terrible effect on the civilian population with food shortages and whatnot. People were rationed, and they would get like a tiny little bit of butter and stuff like that per week. It was a serious problem for civilians. People were starting to go hungry in Germany, and this is, you think about how upset people would get. Germany had one of the highest standards of living in the world before the war. Now they're starving, and they're getting like a ration of like an ounce of coffee a week and whatnot, and they're getting pretty upset. So the war has to be ended soon. Russia basically started quitting once the Bolsheviks took over, and they wanted to sue for peace. The Bolsheviks were willing to give a number of concessions in return for German cooperation, but the Germans demanded a lot and then got a lot. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk ended up giving up a huge amount of territory to Germany, and this was considered a huge coup for Germany to have basically accomplished this massive capitulation on the part of Russia to get them to give up a whole ton of their European territory and create a lot of smaller states that are now going to be under German occupation and German control. And so for Germany, this was a huge deal because they had wanted to expand eastward, and now they're going to get to, it seemed like exactly the victory they wanted. So the Russians had to pay a lot of reparations and under the treaty, and they had to accept the creation of these new countries that would align with Germany. They had to accept the independence of Finland, for example. It was a huge diplomatic win for Germany, as well as a military win. And the concern of the Allies was that now Germany is going to start shifting those troops to the Western Front. All throughout this time, the total war mobilized all the population. So if you looked at the propaganda of the time, you think of You think of the women mostly serving as nurses and and munitions workers, but they really, their entire lives were affected by the war, no differently than the men. You had millions and millions of men being taken away from their homes to go to the front, so women basically became the heads of their households to the extent they hadn't before. Women hadn't, in most of the European countries, didn't have very many rights. Also, there were millions of women that wanted to serve. So many women wanted to volunteer early in the war that the countries didn't know what to do with them. What they all began to discover as the war dragged on was that they became very useful to create these auxiliary female services to their militaries. They wouldn't integrate them. Britain, France, and Germany, they wouldn't, well, Britain and France, Germany did a little bit more so because Ludendorff wanted that total conscription of the whole country, basically. Britain and France would not integrate them into their military, but they would create these services that were like support administrations for the military, which would free up the men to go to the front. And so a lot of the women started getting involved in things like the logistics, like the food preparation, obviously the nursing and the medical care, and really doing a lot of the support work that made the army run. It couldn't have been done without those female auxiliaries, which there were tens of thousands of women in them. The British had the British had about 30,000 women in these in nursing auxiliaries, as well as various others. The Germans had something like 70,000 volunteers doing a variety of jobs. So that was some of the direct participants, but indirectly, if you were in the lower classes, they went to work. Germany's workforce, for example, went from 35% female to 55% female in its civilian workforce. Food production, munition production basically became a female occupation in most of the belligerent nations. Women had to start taking over the jobs that men had once done, like running, the public transportation in the cities. For example, women were the majority of the workers in the Paris subways. That there had only been 3,000 workers in the Paris area that were in those kinds of jobs, and that rose from 3,000 to 124,000 by the end of the war. For a lot of women, this was an exciting time. One of the French workers left behind in one of her letters, this young French girl said, I finally feel like I can accomplish something in my life, that I can be somebody, because women had had so few rights in European society before, and this was kind of just a rapid sea change. Another way it affected women the war affected women was just taking out the eligible bachelor population. So many men died. This was a particular problem in Britain. Britain had a recruitment strategy of join up with your chums in order to try to get multiple guys from the same town to join. And as a result, this would take out all of the men of marriageable age out of a town. And so hundreds of thousands of unmarried young women, especially in Britain, they never found husbands because they were dead. Like the people they might have dated were gone. The Americans went a little further. As early as 1917, the U.S. Navy was recruiting female clerks that they called yeomanettes, and they were given formal duties and naval ranks that were kind of like an auxiliary naval force. The Marine Corps in 1918 advertised for female volunteers, and it got thousands of responses in New York City alone. This was a massive change. Nowhere did the women face more change or accomplish more change than in Russia. Russia was so desperate by the time the war was ending, ending for them, they were completely dependent on their female population to produce the war material. There was actually a PR effort, so they recruited, unlike the other belligerents, Russia would actually recruit women to serve as soldiers, just like the male soldiers. And they created what was called the Russian Women's Battalion. And the idea was to try to inspire the men. So you'd get these women who really wanted to fight, and they were more than happy to. And the other part of the PR was to try to use these women to inspire the men in their communities to fight as well. Because the message was supposed to be, look, the women are fighting, why can't you? And shame whole communities into producing more volunteers. That didn't work particularly well. The women did serve honorably the best they could, even though it was a losing effort, and Russia ended up giving up. So, and then just the effects of, and you read the article about the women in Russia, the effects of just the shortages on the home front were extremely difficult for everyone to deal with. But now the women are largely the heads of households when so many millions of men are gone. Because of what Russia had done, Russia was a leader in equal rights for women. By late 1917, equal pay for women became the law in Russia under the new communist government. And even though it was kind of meaningless, given that they couldn't pay them anything, but on paper they were supposed to be paid the same as men. But what that meant was neither the men or women got pay. But on paper, Russia took away a lot of the civil rights inequalities that had existed, at least on paper, and that would be carried throughout the Soviet era. The Russians were kind of at the forefront throughout the World War II and the Cold War at putting women in prominent roles, such as scientists. So, going into 1918, Germany had one goal, which was to do one last focus on the Western Front and hope that things worked out. Basically, this was another version of the Schlieffen Plan, but much better organized by Ludendorff. Ludendorff didn't have a particular plan, and this was part of the plan was to not have a plan of what were called the Spring Offensive of 1918. The goal was, we're going to do as much as we can, as quickly as we can, to force France out of the war, force Britain into a peace treaty before the United States starts adding manpower and resources. So the first offensive started in March of 1918. The French knew it was coming, British knew it was coming. They'd obviously seen through their reconnaissance all the buildup of forces, and it was actually quite, and this is where Ludendorff was quite skilled. He had trained the soldiers extremely well. So the effort to recruit and conscript and then train these new soldiers, it was quite a remarkable achievement given how stretched Germany had been to this point. So the fact that they could put together this offensive and then train them so well was quite impressive. When asked what the strategic goal was, Ludendorff says, we'll make a hole and the rest will take care of itself. That's how we did it in Russia. And so the thinking was, we're going to push really hard. It's going to hurt the British and French really badly, just like we pushed hard in the Eastern Front, and it hurt the Russians and they gave up. That was the point that was what Ludendorff wanted to accomplish here. So it was largely successful tactically. The Germans won a lot of these initial battles for the first 3 months of the Spring Offensive from March, April, May. They won a lot. They forced retreats all across the front, such as at Operation Michael. That was the first big one. What it's called on this map, the Somme Offensive. That was Operation Michael. Codenamed St. Michael. It succeeded in forcing retreats. The British lost something like 130,000 casualties. The French lost about 70,000. The Germans, I think, lost about 130 some. So they accomplished a lot more casualties than they took. The problem was they couldn't afford to take nearly that as many as they did, but they did accomplish more than you'd have expected by that point. One way they did it is that both sides had improved their tactics, but especially the Germans. They did what was called a creeping barrage. Both sides would do this, which meant the artillery would kind of fire ahead of the soldiers, and then the soldiers would advance right behind these artillery barrages, and that way the artillery was supposedly to clear out any resistance, and then the infantry would attack. What Ludendorff had trained his soldiers to do for this offensive was actually kind of foreshadowing World War II tactics. The goal was to move, not to just fire. And so in some cases, the initial waves of infantry would be told not even to take out their rifles. They'd strap their rifles to their back and just carry some grenades. And the goal is to just run and keep running. Just run forward, and if you find any enemy, you throw the grenades at them, but you just keep going. Another way this worked well, and the reason why the German infantry and then the shock troops were able to advance so effectively, was because they, instead of just walking, they would move, but they would move tactically. They would follow the creeping barrage and then take cover in the craters that the barrage would create, and then move to the next craters that the extended creep of the artillery barrage would create. And so they'd kind of jackrabbit across the no man's land, and also use as much coordination as possible between artillery, infantry troops firing grenades, whatever air forces they had, and the poison gas, especially using the poison gas strategically in order to use gas in an area, then send your grenade troops, then send your shock troops after all the gas is blown out, and hopefully taking out a lot of the soldiers or your enemy. And in the meantime, when you're moving, you're hopping from the concealment and cover to another concealment and cover area. So that kept the troops moving, and it worked quite well. And then you make a new plan for the next day based on where you are. And so there wasn't a clear, like, this is what we're going to take this day. There was you get as far as you can, and then we'll figure out the plan the next day and get as far as we can that day. So these initial infantry attacks would involve that rapid movement. That was pretty effective at first, and did succeed in pushing the French and British back. And then the second wave of the attack would be done by what were called the stormtroopers or shock troops, the very well-trained German soldiers with heavier weapons that would then mop up what remained in the areas that the initial wave had captured. So these shock troops, the success at accomplishing more casualties than they took, that was a new thing in the war, and they became kind of heroes and kind of lionized and also remembered, kind of legendary in retelling of the war. So the French and British did adjust, and they did eventually start figuring out how to combat this. Philippe Pétain was in charge of the French defenses, and he managed to do a controlled retreat well enough in order to exhaust the Germans. And so, because there was not a plan, what Ludendorff accomplished was tactical initial successes, but then his lines were spread out too much. He didn't have enough troops to hold what he had taken, and so the counterattacks were quite bad. Because his troops were now stretched out over too long of a line of front. So by the summer of 1918, these offensives are starting to get pushed back. The big push back where the German army started to collapse was in the late summer of 1918. By this point, the Americans are providing a lot more troops, providing a lot more material. General Pershing, who was the overall American commander of the American Expeditionary Force, started putting his army into offensive operations, and that really started turning the tide. The big loss the Germans suffered was at Amiens in 1918, the Amiens salient. They just couldn't defend it. Their troops were stretched too thin across the line, and huge numbers of German casualties were taken and prisoners taken. The first time their defenses really didn't hold. Throughout the whole war, Germany had been able to do more with less. And now that was falling apart. Now they were almost outnumbered a good 2-1 on the Western Front, thanks to the American contribution. So they're really starting to get beaten now, and they're pulling back from the Hindenburg Line, and no longer can defend that. So now they're getting pushed back into Belgium, and it looks pretty clear by August, September, they're going to get pushed back into Germany if this goes on much longer. So the Battle of Amiens would have happened early August 1918. That was the real kind of a nail in the coffin. Ludendorff called it the blackest day in the history of the German army. He knew it was over. It was a few weeks later he went to talk to the Kaiser and said, it's over. Like, we cannot continue this war. We're going to collapse, and the Allies will be able to invade Germany proper. The tanks were actually somewhat useful here. Here's some British Mark IV tanks. The tanks got a little bit better, a little bit faster, a little bit more useful. And the air tactics had improved by this point, and the German offensives, they just petered out, and now they're trying to defend what they had taken in the offensives was impossible now. Just too few resources.